Thank you. Now, I want to carry on where I left off last week because it helps us to see where we're coming from and also to place the current ongoing debate with regard to what authentic liturgy is against a wider backdrop, which is the correct one, where we're coming from. Now, we know that Pope Benedict, even before he was Pope, was very much involved in this ongoing debate, and he felt quite strongly that the only correct way of living the explosion of renewal that was potentially in the Second Vatican Council was to have it lived in a spirit of continuity, that we do not, as it were, think that we're the first to get it right. Liturgy does not belong to us. We're coming from something ancient, powerful, and divine. And the Holy Spirit is involved in the liturgy of the Church insofar as calmly and serenely He has made it grow organically from the first origins, which are those that we're examining right now. But we know that Pope Benedict was keen on getting this message through. He would refer to this way of approaching the issue as the hermeneutic, that means the interpretation, the hermeneutic of continuity. So, when we have a document, we look at it and see where it's coming from and what is its wider context. So, in this sense, what happened in the period following the Council was that in practice it was partly, not entirely, but partly understood as a break, and that led to damage. It was viewed as a rupture, a creation ex novo, from new, of something which was, as it were, to be invented, and that could but lead to catastrophe. And it has been pointed out that it is linked to a more profound issue again, that of a contaminated thought pattern, even actually sometimes a contaminated theology insofar as the belittling of the divinity of Christ, his otherness, tends to bring, as it were, liturgy into our own pocket, as though we were in control of it and able to use it, because it is then just a human thing, and Christ is made a brother, one of us, a mate, and that is bound to change the orientation, the very dynamic of the liturgy that we celebrate. And so a change in mindset is required, which reads and interprets the decrees of the Council in terms of continuity with the past. We should also add, concerning problems in theology, that the way we regard and define the person of Christ can also produce a negative effect upon liturgical theory and practice, if we depart from the magisterium. Indeed, Ratzinger believes that the criteria for liturgical renewal cannot be separated from the question which Jesus himself asked his disciples at Caesarea Philippi: "Who do you say that the Son of Man is?" At the same time, the positive liturgical fruits after the Council, also acknowledged by Joseph Ratzinger, should be recognized, and the work of many theologians and liturgists. Now, in practice, it is to be recognized that there has been a healing of several aspects which needed adjusting in the life of the Church up until the renewal. I was just discussing the issue with a close friend of mine in the priesthood. We were together in Rome as students and ordained about the same time, and he would be fairly conservative in his approach to things, and he, like myself, is able to celebrate in the new and the old form. And he was the other day celebrating in a situation where the priests of the community he was staying with and ministering to were exclusively in the old rite, and he noticed a few things there which hit him quite strongly, and he shared this with me. that what was happening was, and I've picked this up myself as well independently, that the communities of priests who only have the extraordinary form, the old rite, and are not exposed to the new, the ordinary form, these tend to have precisely those maladies that were there all over the place until the renewal. And he pointed out one or two of these. In practice, it was the speed and the way in which one can almost say that the notion of thinking about the words as they came seemed not to be there. It was just an unstoppable flow of a very large number of words. Now, I'm oversimplifying, but there's something of that in there, and we have to realize that that was the problem. It comes to the fore precisely in those that are not exposed to the renewal that did actually adjust that. Let's face it, it did adjust it in many parts of the world, not entirely. Unfortunately, in Ireland, it didn't manage to adjust it because a lot of the same thing carried on, and many priests carry on at the same rhythm. And it's partly linked with the rosary because we actually say the Mass at the same speed as we say the rosary in Ireland quite often. Therefore, it's a bit of a rush against the clock. So that's not true renewal. But in countries where it was thought out, there has been genuinely this thrust of calming down considerably the pace and therefore engaging with the individual words. They are said to be understood and prayed in all their density. Now, he was commenting on this and he was observing what was going on there, even from cultured priests, but it was never approached, it was never attacked, it was just the situation as it was received, and it was carrying on. So basically it was a huge adjustment that had to be made in the council years to renew all that. And Paul VI did actually comment in the period following the application of the renewal that actually had happened. Now he was pointing out in that discourse that there were things coming in which weren't correct and he was trying to adjust them, and he had it this way. It was not to be thought that the renewal, that the present liturgy, was to be equated with, in any way, a desacralization, because that was a separate issue. That had come in, and it was what he was trying to adjust as early as the late 60s, early 70s. And he was trying to point out that this other thing, this abuse, was quite unnecessary. That was in the early 70s he was putting this into print and getting it round, tried to warn the church that that was not to come in. Of course, it didn't have the effect it wanted because, unfortunately, things were coming in very quickly which were desacralizing. But anyway, the thing was, he did point out, while making that discourse, that the other thing had actually come in, and he was glad about that. There had been this adjustment of the mentality that henceforth we did try to engage with the words and to pray in the spirit of renewal in the way that it had been intended. That has gone. And I have noticed this, and my friend noticed the same thing. And I remember discussing the thing also with somebody in Italy way back when I was involved with celebrating now and again when they were stuck. The old High Mass in the old rite there, it was the one place in the Archdiocese of Siena where it was allowed, and therefore occasionally they would call one of us when they were stuck for a celebrant. It was done quite well, actually, and they were formed by French people, but they were formed well, and it was done with great reverence. But in a meal that we had afterwards, the person responsible for that place, he just made a casual remark which hit me. It was this: because we'd had grace, we'd prayed together before eating, and I did so in a spirit of, as it were, spontaneity and authenticity, thinking about the words and creating them as I was going along in a meaningful way for that particular local assembly of people, lovely people. But he just made this passing comment afterwards. One can notice a priest who celebrates in the new rite because he does that kind of thing. In other words, he wasn't at all displeased because it hit him. Rather than have something which was just rattled off, it was actually something that was made an encounter of prayer, and he actually liked it. So that's the kind of knock-on effect of the renewal that the whole of our prayer also does become more personalized and more electrified if we wanted to. That's the real renewal. It extends to every realm of prayer, also the rosary. The rosary should be calmly said, and not in a way which is actually an insult to heaven, because the speed at which it's done sometimes is nothing less than an insult. That can't be honouring to our Blessed Lady or to anyone else, because we don't speak to each other at that speed. And also it can be made to be felt and electrified by little meditations between the decades, and even moments of song put in, like Ave Ave Maria and so on. These can be put in and make it genuinely, as actually John Paul II wanted in the document he published on the Rosary. He did want this to happen, and he was suggesting also using biblical meditations, quotations from Scripture between the decades. That brings it to life very much, and then one can apply each decade for a specific intention, which might be that prayed for by a particular group. So these things make it live, and we do actually extend into every part of our life the renewal that potentially was there in the Second Vatican Council. So this is part of a wider context. So we need to get this straight, that the present liturgy should not be equated with desacralization. There was no need for that to come in. It should be quite the contrary, actually, because if one celebrates sometimes in the old rite, as a celebrant, one is quite frankly scandalized, because if one has people, adults usually, who are not well formed when they're serving, they go at a colossal speed with the prayers at the foot of the altar, and it's actually gibberish. Now that's not correct. So one notices there also people who celebrate in the normal form, the ordinary form of the Mass, and then occasionally celebrating the old rite, they approach also the old rite as Benedict XVI wanted, with the good of the new, because he did insist on this when publishing Summorum Pontificum, which made possible the old rite again largely all over the world. He did insist that there should be a process of osmosis, of mutual healing between the two, that the old should lead to a notion of the sacred which we have lost, and that the new should lead to a sense of authenticity and calm, which in the old rite exclusively one can lose if one isn't careful because of the large number of words. So I have noticed that actually, that the difference between when I have my own little altar boys, we've formed from earliest childhood, they're very small when they started, they always do it from memory, and the way they do it very calmly, the right speed, and the way that sometimes adults who come into their play, it's quite different, because the adults have come from somewhere that we're not coming from, and they have not been corrected. So there is something there to be aware of, that there was a need for healing and renewal, and genuine renewal at the Second Vatican Council. It was addressing a problem. It had to be addressed. And it was something that concerned the whole Church. For the liturgy of the Church is the very life of the Church, is the Church at prayer, and therefore heaven and earth meeting, so it has to be done well. The thing is that it was partly, not entirely, but partly hijacked. I pointed out before that where it was hijacked least was in the contemplative life, because their monasteries and convents, where they're genuinely spending their whole time, their whole life in prayer and love and adoration, are bound in a natural, spontaneous way to apply in that same mode what they're doing, and therefore the danger is less there. I remember hearing that comment in a letter actually from the Abbot of Prynich way back, that he was saying it's a problem out there in the parishes, not in the monasteries, because in the monasteries things are done well anyway, because God is loved, and so there's a calm there. So, just to be aware, the problem is on that deeper level, and here we're actually addressing the question, because it's also theological, because a correct thought of Christ leads also to a correct approach to Christ. So, the prescriptions of the Holy See should be obediently followed. Now see, what's going on there, that's linked with it, because when this element of man, and therefore a free-for-all, because man is in charge, comes in, it's a form of Protestantism. And it's not as good as Protestantism, actually, because at least Protestants don't do that. They don't have it, therefore they don't disobey. But we're trying to imitate them when we get into that mode of disobedience and a free-for-all. It just doesn't work. We're poor Catholics and we're poor Protestants when we do that. So obedience is the sign of precisely a theological understanding of what we're doing. We obey Christ, whom we're adoring, by obeying his voice, which is the church. Vox Christi. For us, the voice of Christ is the voice of the rubrics of the church. We don't do our own thing. We have no right to if we want to honour him. So humbly approaching to see exactly what should be done and executing it with care is the correct minimal approach to good liturgy. God is not free to bless disobedience. And one comes across so many celebrants who just think that it's always better to throw in a bit of their own rather than just follow calmly what's there. And it's actually a form of presumption and pride. It's a participation in the sin of Lucifer. Non serviam, I will not obey. It's a form of pride, spiritual pride. To see what's going on in some of our celebrations is quite nerve-wracking. And then that extends to the people of God. If they're taught to go into that mode, they'll do something of the same thing. It's rather sad because children will be educated by good education. They'll be miseducated by bad education. One sees all kinds of things going on at children's celebrations. The other day, I happened to be there when it was largely a children's mass there, certainly in the parish church. But then, with regard to one of the readings, it was some profane reading, some poem or something. And of course, the child said at the end of it, "This is the word of the Lord." Well, the word of the Lord indeed. To which everyone replies, "Thanks be to God." Now, therefore they have to be obeyed. Something which Ratzinger also underlined according to recognized forms of rubrical interpretation, and above all, in a proper liturgical spirit. He has an aside somewhere, Ratzinger, in his book on the spirit of the liturgy, about when, of course, he was a younger celebrant there. He would have been somewhere in Germany celebrating as, I presume he would have already been a bishop, I'm not sure, probably was, and he was in the situation where one of these mimes was performed to express the penitential rite. Of course, he, in his wry sense of humour, added, because there was a wonderful round of applause at the end of it, could anything have been more far removed from the true spirit of the penitential rite? Yet, of course, had a round of applause. It was a beautiful act. So that's what we're at. Are we actually genuinely expressing penance if we get to a round of applause? So the Holy See has attempted to rectify the widespread liturgical abuses in the Church and to cultivate veneration and love for the Holy Eucharist, for example, in Redemptione Sacramentum. That was published by the Congregation for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments on the 25th of March 2004. Pope Benedict himself, as Pope, the following year published Sacramentum Caritatis, and there we have a more personalized input. He is fairly keen on removing abuses and also sacrilege, because he does actually go even into real issues of what in St. Paul is referred to as not recognizing the body. Sacrilege comes in when people do not recognize the body, do not discern the body, and do not therefore prepare themselves as they might do. In other words, when these massive assemblies take place, when all and sundry come forth without any distinction, it is a problem, because there's a high proportion of sacrilege going on, and he does address this issue quite clearly. But Redemptione Sacramentum, the previous year by the Congregation for Divine Worship, here we have specific issues coming in and are addressed for what they are, abuses. Remember, actually, it just happened that year I was supposed to be giving some lectures, some input, a kind of retreat in a contemplative convent, and it was a convent where a friend of ours had entered and was there in formation, and it was a good convent, very fervent. They got up in the night, they had adoration, they had it was a very good convent, but in that reading of this document in the refectory, that was one of the issues that had been picked up in the document, that things like shared homilies, that is, people themselves sharing on the gospel in the celebration of the Eucharist itself, was an abuse and had to be stopped. Well, they were doing that on a daily basis at least on weekdays, in that community. And when I heard about that, I did explain that that was going to be a problem to the Mother Superior. And I didn't actually go because there was a problem there. I couldn't go along with that. And anyway, I met her later, and she did express the fact that I had not accepted that had made the community actually a bit reflect. So it hadn't done any harm. Because when the priests go along with all these things, that's part of the problem. Also, other things creep in and stay in by influence from one place to another. Things like one goes to some places and one finds that against what is prescribed, recorded singing comes in. That kind of thing, it's not allowed because that's quite inauthentic. And what the Vatican wants with insistence is authentic liturgy, that things have to be true signs. And so to have something recorded, some other person's or people's singing and using that at the Mass itself is abusive. And also the putting on of some meditation or the invading of the people of God through imposing upon them during the sacred moment of Holy Communion, just like that. Somebody gets up or sits down and reads somebody's meditation. These things, they're questionable because these are sacred moments of intimacy. I remember actually having this reaction from a good prior I knew, a Benedictine. He had just been to the convent where he was celebrating Mass there, and he'd come back and he used the word intrusive because during the quiet moment of Holy Communion they'd put on this, whatever it was something recorded anyway, and he just didn't make any comment to them, but he made a comment to us that when he got back he felt it was intrusive. In other words, the sacred moment of Holy Communion, that should not be in any way encroached upon, certainly without the permission of the celebrant. And even people who have this itch to blot out that sacred moment by themselves intoning something, anything at all but silence, it's a bit of a nuisance. One day I was celebrating in a very good prayer group. I go there every month actually. It's a very good one. But then there was one person who came in and that person had a tendency to be a bit invasive anyway. But when it came to Holy Communion, that person, of course, did start singing something, whatever it was, and repeated it. And then one person, I think actually a nun, just quietly said, shh, and she got the message. In other words, people didn't want it. People quietly, especially in a good prayer group, just want to be left alone with their thoughts sometimes. And to have someone chirp in anything but silence is a great nuisance and a lack of delicacy for the people of God there present. We noticed actually how Pope Benedict gave great edification to England when he did celebrate in Westminster and gave a discreet message. There were two very substantial moments of silence. One was after the homily, which he gave calmly and well, as he always does. A long time sitting, taking it in. And then a very long one after Holy Communion. And it was a time free from music. There was music as well for when they were actually distributing. But then he deliberately made that point, obviously, a long, powerful, dense moment of perfect silence. And it was electrified by genuine prayer. Televised. They were televising silence now. Over millions of people that were hearing this and sharing that silence. It was far more powerful than anything else. And it was a clear message to the Church. The best prayer at times at Holy Communion itself is dense, spirit-filled silence. Now, so the Holy See has attempted to rectify the widespread liturgical abuses in the Church and to cultivate veneration and love for the Holy Eucharist, for example, in this document, Redemptionis Sacramentum. Cardinal Ratzinger is recognized as one of the driving forces behind this instruction. A recent edition of the Missale Romanum, that's what we're using right now, can be beautifully celebrated. And though little may appear to have practically changed, it is a step in the right direction, with more emphasis on liturgical tradition in the Institutio Generalis and features such as the restored or optional form of the Vigil of Pentecost. Another one would be the optional use of the prayer of the people during Lent. I remember one time in Rome having a very prolonged and dense and powerful and beautiful celebration of Pentecost, the Vigil of Pentecost, just like Easter. in this community of enclosed nuns. They were lovely Augustinian nuns there, and they had genuine preparation for the coming of the Holy Spirit. But it was liturgical. It was the full exploitation of the liturgy as we have it at night. However, it has to be said that any mistakes made at an official level in the formulation of the new liturgy, and anything which gives the impression of breaking with the liturgical tradition of the Church, should be humbly recognized. Along with this, the possibilities offered by a reform of the reform should also be considered in order to produce a liturgy more in continuity with the heritage of the Church's living liturgical past and with the Second Vatican Council. It is not only a question of solely correcting liturgical abuses. There needs to be a more open and courageous dialogue between those great number of liturgists who oppose the reform of the reform and any trace of preconceived liturgy. In other words, there's a problem, you see, that people are afraid of anything which in vaguest form smacks of the past. It's a notion of discontinuity and rupture which is not healthy. So any trace of preconceived liturgy which is frequently caricatured, people kind of throw stones at it, they make fun of it. And in so doing, they show actually their lack of culture. And Pope Benedict actually has put that into print with regard to the attitude of some who regard all that went before the Second Vatican Council as something which shows that they are treating as unholy that which has been regarded for 2 millennia as the most sacred. It cannot be done. One has to have a deep and profound humble respect for 2 millennia and to see the saints that has formed. Can we say that we are formed so quickly and so drastically by what we have quite often in our celebrations? These were exposed directly and without protection, as it were, to the direct attack of God, because God came through to them in the quiet moments, and the sacrality of the vertical had an impact on the soul. Now, if we haven't got a good DJ, we have a very shallow liturgy, and it's very much of the human that we get. And does that sanctify us to the same extent? Question mark, big question mark. So, this notion of reacting to all that's gone before us is very proud. There needs to be a more open and courageous dialogue between, therefore, those who wish to apply this kind of reform of the reform of which Ratzinger speaks, with those who also accept Vatican II, but have reservations about its implementation in liturgical matters and wish to reform the current liturgical one. Now the point is this, you see, it's not either or, but both and that's the whole thrust of correct renewal. If we get into the camp system, this entrenchment thing of thus people against each other, then we're bound to be in a non-fruitful dialogue. And that is why we do well also to look further afield than our local parish. It's good to travel and to go into other countries and cultures and see how it's done there. Because especially on Ireland, like Ireland itself, we're a bit in a closed shop and we're not exposed to a challenge, especially in the Republic actually. Now, therefore, in an area which is in the extreme west of the world, we're not much exposed to the adjustment, for instance, of the Byzantine, which is also an important part of our heritage as Christians. So I'll come back to that in a minute, but it's important as we go now back to our origins to see this element of where we're coming from so as to see correctly where we're at right now. Otherwise we'll have this notion of being in a free-for-all in which we ourselves are the creator of our own prayer. So, we carry on where we left off. Now, before I go any further, I would like to share something which had an impact on me. It's just something which had been picked up by somebody a bit mischievously, but it does make a point. It's the extremes to which one can get in the interest of renewal compared with the calm, serene heritage received by ourselves and also by the East. Here we have what went on some time ago in a huge celebration in Moscow. It's the Patriarch. Here you can see, I can hear anyway, the chant, which is very majestic. It's actually Good Friday. and the incense is just going calmly around the dead Christ, as it were, and this polyphonic choir, and all that one sees is calm gestuality. Everything is calculated, there's nothing spontaneous, but it just follows the ancient rubrics, and it carries the people. Now the people aren't expected to do anything, but they're just alone in a long period of exposure to something higher than themselves. And it has an impact on their soul, because one can see how actually over a long period of time exposed to divine majesty, one is quietened. It's called in Greek hesychia, this notion of silence, and it does change the soul. And by the way, that's something which has an effect on the whole praying church. Now compare this now with the kind of thing that this picks up here. It happens in Los Angeles, where you have them coming in with the gospel procession. Actually, they're coming at the beginning of the celebration, and you have the deacon here singing away, or actually dancing away with the gospel book. So on he goes, dancing away, and then here you go back, making a point obviously, but it's nevertheless something we have to take on board, because they're warning us that we're forgetting where we're coming from. So I've noticed before that actually one difference between one element precisely of our prayer, and therefore our life, is that those who are coming from the East, who are at the head of these celebrations, and therefore the head of the churches, are all monks, because all the bishops have to be monks in the East because of the law of celibacy for the bishops, and so therefore they're all coming from this atmosphere of hesychasm, of silence, of divine prayer, not in any way contaminated. So that's going to have an impact on the whole church. So just be aware of that. That's part of our problem in the West, that it's not based on that calm formation of those who come into the head of the church as bishops. They're coming from a different background quite often, and therefore they're bringing with them what they've got already when they were younger priests. And now, in the post-conciliar years, they're those formed precisely in the renewal, but having not known, some of them, what came before. So it's more dangerous. So here you go back now. The only thing that this picks up now in Los Angeles, it's actually coming up now to the altar, and you see all these bishops there. But then just kind of the difference in style is just so impressive, because see, this thumping noise, this kind of electrified guitar, it's not the best way to approach the divine, and therefore if that's the kind of thing that becomes normal, we're bound to be suffering from it, because our interior life is going to suffer. It's not having the same effect, it's not pacifying us in the same way as we might have had we celebrated, and we'd had before in the past, as we see now being celebrated well in other places. So here is the entry procession there. It looks very empowered and so on, because there's a lot of moving going on in the assembly, a huge assembly of people, but one questions, are they actually in prayer or in self-celebration? That is the problem. Clapping all the time, you see, and that's what's going on. Even the celebrant there, the bishop, he's clapping away as he goes to kiss the altar. But they're making a point. However, the point is well made. And we need to be careful that we don't get into that bandwagon. Because every time actually that we in any way collude, we're part of the problem. Even the very fact of applauding in church is part of the problem. So there we are, just to point out the issue, because it's a real issue, because the fact that that kind of thing can be accepted as normal in a pontifical celebration with a huge number of bishops there, you can see there was a huge congress going on there in Los Angeles, it does make you reflect where we're at. Now, before I go any further, I just want to make another little aside, but it's something which in that wider context also is relevant, because it's what hit me there when I was transferred to Italy, because what kept me there very quickly was the power of the liturgical life, because it was a French community in Italy there, and I'd been transferred urgently from Ireland there when things were in a bit of a problem there that may have been in Ireland, and then I was just hit between the eyes by the otherness of the celebrations going on there, because these French, they have a notion of things which is quite different. They have a serene, majestic way of approaching things, and it's not hurried, and of course they have the heritage of the Gregorian chant because of Solem and so on. Our chanters there, our cantors were formed in Solem, and so we had all that tradition. And in fact, we used to live from them. We used to make these CDs, and they sold very well. The acoustics were very good. But anyway, when I got there, and very quickly I was professed after a year, because my vows were just one more year to go, and then I was ordained immediately then, first of all to diaconate, and then a few months later to the priesthood. But as I was preparing for ordination, I was just looking at what we're doing, because the high altar was the same one. We kept everything as it was. We didn't bash things around. It was an ancient church, and the altar was there perfectly and well able to be used, so we used it. And the whole thrust was as it was meant to be by the architect. If you mess up a church, you don't see the vision of the architect. You think we know better. So anyway, they kept things, and it worked perfectly well, because you were facing the rising sun in the morning as the sun rose, the east window, because it was facing east, and then all this incense, because we had incense every day, and the Gregorian chant to go with it. So it was a whole atmosphere, and it worked every time perfectly well. You just opened your mouth, and the whole church was filled with your voice, because it was an empty church. The acoustics were perfect. And we didn't use an organ when we were chanting, that was only used for interludes between. So, pure human voice, and the church was made for that. So, this I wrote there as the time was coming close to ordination, remembering what I was about to do and where we were coming from, and how, once ordained, that old experience of the saints would be ours. It would be the same power, the same sacrifice, the same place. And it was as though that's how it should be, continuity with the past. The same thing coming through. We just made the minimal changes necessary to get into line with the Second Vatican Council, but it was essentially the new of the old. It was the new Mass, but celebrated with the maximum of continuity. I remember somebody saying that a young person came on retreat for ordination, a Frenchman actually, was about to be ordained, so he made his retreat with us, and he made this comment before he went away. It's the place on earth where the new Mass is celebrated in the best possible way. That was his remark. The most beautiful Mass in the new rite ever he'd seen. And so that's what we were coming to. It's very moving. So I just quote now what I wrote there. Won't do any harm, just sit back and listen, because it was coming from my heart, and I was about to be ordained and used there for this altar, the same altar which was there since the Middle Ages. So the title is actually in French. It means Mass on the world and facing east. Messe sur le monde, face à l'Orient. Messe sur le monde. Mass over the world, facing east. Lines written at the approach of ordination. A time and half a time, a little time, holds me from thee, my King, and we shall stand alone upon the Orme. For small steps climb to greatness, where fond cherubs fear to land. This is the stone where oft this miracle was heard, times past to pass. This is the home away from home, where but a particle shines in the heart, wherein strange myriads come. I have come home, my God, and yesterday stands safely at the door. For evermore I shall adorn thee touch, as touch they did, that knew how this to handle long before. For long is not our song, and we hand on a little secret, that or old dawns shone. So, we're not priests forever in this world, although we're priests forever in the next. I mean, we never cease to be a priest, but the priesthood goes on. We pass the torch from one to the other. And it's rather moving when one buries a priest. One sees, actually, that that priest can't do it anymore, but is asking you from the tomb, carry on where I left off. And we do it and pass the relay to someone else. So we have to form, we have to form, we have to form. So it's very important that when we have these altar boys, we form and we invite. And we don't be shy to invite. I remember hearing that in the same monastery there was a young Frenchman coming to his retreat for marriage. He was about to get married in France, and he was marrying a good Christian girl. They were going to have a good Christian family. But when he came to leaving retreat in the monastery where he'd been touched by grace, he did say this: "On y a tous pensé," we have all thought of it, that is of the priesthood. Mais il n'y avait personne qui soit là pour nous appeler. There was no one there to call us. There was no one there to call us. Never been challenged, never been called. How many vocations do not come forth because no one dares to mention them? Indeed, it's a counterculture now. The media are against the priests. The last thing one wants for one's child is to think of the priesthood. So, I return now in these last minutes to where we're coming from. Liturgy has to be distinguished from private prayer. Just to be clear, the word liturgy in the East is used where we use Holy Mass. They use the word divine liturgy, and they don't use the word Mass at all. That is only correct for the Western Rite. They use the divine liturgy to express the most sacred part of their prayer life. Now, there is the way in which we talk about liturgy in a way which is global. It is not incorrect to speak of all actions pertaining to the divine office as also liturgical, because they are part of the public prayer of the Church. But it is not correct to speak of the Rosary as liturgy. That's a separate issue altogether. The Rosary has suffered as a result of the renewal in the liturgy, because it was, by some modern thinkers, downgraded. Now, that needn't have happened because it's supplementary. It's not either or. What has happened is that it is rare now to have the Rosary, as it were, celebrated in church. And what I mean is, whereas before there had been the evening devotions in many parts of the Catholic world, until the evening Mass came in on a Sunday, and then it was put on the Saturday evening, many parishes throughout the Catholic world would have had a second moment of prayer, separate and different in style from the Mass itself. It was paraliturgical. It wasn't actually liturgical because it was made of the Rosary, of a sermon, which is kind of important, and also of benediction, which is a sacramental. Now, therefore, there was an element of popular devotion coming in there, but it was solemnized insofar as the incense was being used for incense, for the adoration, for benediction, and there was a sermon given actually in the pulpit. Therefore, there was a solemn element about it, and the Rosary would have been said publicly, and therefore with a certain dignity. Now, that was all lost in a very short time, actually. In very few places retained anything resembling it on a Sunday evening, which is a pity, because in practice now, the average believer only has one form of prayer in church on a Sunday. And because of the large number of celebrations here and there which a priest has to cover, the quality then is not what it might be. So he is actually suffering because he hasn't got what he would have had before. A Catholic wanting it before could have had the sung celebration once on a Sunday. There's the 11 o'clock one would have been the high one. That in a good church, there would have been a proper celebration there, fully sung and with all the trimmings, incense and so on. A real notion of celebration coming in there. Nothing was spared. But in practice, what one has now in many places is that one has just the said celebration with a few hymns thrown in. So there is a downgrading there of what's available to the average Catholic. Now, the average, I mean, we can travel, we can find a high mass still, but it's not easy. One has to go to Dublin or somewhere to find one celebrated with the choir. I mean, a proper one, full thing as it used to be. But then the other one has gone altogether. It's very, very rare now to have a second thing happening at all in church on a Sunday. There might occasionally be for a special occasion, but on the whole it just doesn't happen. So basically one is back down in favour of the football. I mean, that's where people go. And that's how Sunday is carried out then. It's all lost once one is out of one's minimal duty. The Sunday is no longer fully as it might have been the day of the Lord completely. Now that's a pity, because if we're giving the minimum for God and we're not able to be blessed ourselves fully as we might be. There might be a prayer group and we can go to that, but it might be fantastic. But on the whole, they don't happen on a Sunday. So we're down-changed. It's a pity, because we've lost the blessing of a felt day of the Lord, different from any other day. And what's happened? Well, business has come into it. The shops are open. So if we're not careful, we go there instead of going to church a second time. No, we haven't gained. So it's part also of our problem as Catholics. We have a problem with regard to the quality of our Sunday. So, there. This question then of the Rosary, it can be brought back in the family, but then again, we ought to do it in a proper way, which is edifying for the children and means something to them. And also, it can be brought into our prayer groups. It's a good thing to have a prayer group where there is Rosary happening, Divine Mercy Chaplet and so on, but then it mustn't stop there. There should also be room for genuine sharing in some shape or form. It's not enough in a good prayer group just to have said prayers said at high speed. That's not sufficient. We need to make these in the same spirit of renewal as we have in the Vatican Council, have our prayer groups also vivified, and to get away from just the structure. We have to be daring enough to have renewal also in our prayer groups. But again, always in dignity and serenity, avoiding too much of the human. There's always danger in prayer groups that they become, if we're not careful, they can also be in some way contaminated and hijacked by people who are very noisy, people who use these as a podium for their own glory in some shape or form, indirectly of course, but nevertheless it's there. We can hog a prayer group, and it's always a nuisance. But God and our Blessed Lady must be the centre of attention, not human beings, when we're in prayer groups. So liturgy then is different from shared prayer, from devotions, insofar it is the public work of the soul. The Godhead is adored publicly by that very notion of liturgy, which is actually of pre-Christian origin. Liturgia is a Greek composite word, meaning originally it would have been a public duty, a service in the state undertaken by a citizen. There can be different sorts of worship, not worship, but worship is one of them. You see, that's one of them. But it was also public office in general. It can extend to several parts of life. But then specifically, it was taken on board as the specific public role of the Church in prayer, and therefore it is no longer a private thing. And remember, our origin is Greek, and therefore this word liturgia is bound to be there from the beginning. It's only with times in the West we take on this other word of Mass, which is not used at all in the eastern part of the Church. And we must remember also that the instinct that we had in the early liturgy was also something looking further back than where we're coming from. Therefore we have a lot of the Hebrew coming in. Now, there is the element, and I finish with this, of the overlapping of the spontaneous with the solemn, the spontaneous with the received, the spontaneous with the given. Because we know from Justin Martyr and early testimony, even St. Paul himself, that there was an element of spontaneity in the very first celebrations of the liturgy, because the readings would have been taken from sacred documents, but then the specification of how much should be read was not immediate. That came in with time. And so we had also elements of spontaneity in the prayer of the celebrant. The celebrant had a certain freedom in the early stages, but because of the venerability of the early celebrants, they were the first generation, the people listening would have respected greatly their wording. And if one notices what happens, a person in prayer will have his ways of falling back on formulae, on expressions which become dear to him and habitual. So even the individual celebrants in the first stages would have become habituated. They would have got into a certain way of doing things very early on, their own style, which the people would then get used to and instinctively imitate. So very early on, things became, as it were, virtually codified. Therefore, the venerability of the first innovations made them sacred. So what we're coming from is very, very ancient. And the antiquity of it all can be seen in the very Eucharistic prayer itself. The old Roman canon is of apostolic origin. We have it there quite clearly in the wording. The chalice is the same chalice. This, now, preclarum calicem is what is used in the Latin. It's very, very ancient. They're using the same chalice as the Lord himself in the early celebrations. And so therefore, we see where we're coming from. It was so sacred that they could not change that bit. It has carried on. So we'll carry on next time and investigate more this element of where we're coming from and the sacrality of what we've received. I just finished with this. It's not a question, therefore, of either or both, but both and. And this nation of cancelling where we're coming from in the interest of being modern is very shallow, and a person of shallow culture is quite happy with that. If we want to be completely balanced, we have to see all the richness of our brethren throughout the centuries and have the humility to see we have a lot to learn, far more than we learned ever since we got out of Vatican II, as though we were the first to get it right, ever, the first to understand what he was about. But actually, we're just the first to cop on. We're just starting where the others left off. So, same time, same channel. We'll carry on next week.